Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining me today for episode 795 of People Behind the Science with our guest, Dr. Renato Polimanti. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and if you want to get connected with us to hear about even more amazing people doing great science, you can find us on Facebook, and we're also on Blue Sky at PBT Science, and I'm at PhD Marie. We're excited to get connected with all of you, and I'm excited to share a fantastic conversation with today's guests. So listeners, I hope you're ready to meet another one of our outstanding people behind the science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to be speaking with our guest scientist, Dr. Renato Polimanti. So, Renato, welcome to the show today. How are you?
Good. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you so much for the invite.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm excited to tell our listeners a little bit more about you and how you got to where you are today. So, listeners, Renato is an Associate Professor of Psychiatry, and he also has appointments in Biomedical Informatics and Data Science, as well as Chronic Disease Epidemiology at the Yale University School of Medicine, the School of Public Health, and the Wu Tsai Institute. Renato completed his bachelor's degree, master's degree, and PhD at the University of Rome Tor Vergata. Afterwards, he conducted postdoctoral research at the Yale University School of Medicine before joining the faculty at Yale. He has received a variety of awards and honors for his work, including the One Mind Rising Star Computational Psychiatry Research Award, an Explorers Award from the Simons Foundation Autism Research Initiative, the Early Career Investigator Award from the Million Veteran Program, and Young Investigator Awards from the journal Genes, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, and the International Society of Applied Biological Sciences. And today, Renato, we want to get to know you as a researcher, of course, but also as a person. So can you start by telling us, what do you like to do when you're not very busy doing science?
I'm not a very active person. I tend to be kind of lazy.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that I like the most is reading, because I can do it on my couch. So I like to read anything from novels to more scientific books about other areas that I'm not working on. I like to eat. I like to try different types of food, and I like to travel. So I like to go around, see different countries and seeing different architectures, people interact in different ways. These are the three main things that I like to do when I'm not working.
Oh, that's fantastic. I think we've got hobbies in common here. Reading, food, and travel are things that I love as well. So what are some of your favorite foods?
I'm Italian, and definitely I like Italian food, authentic Italian food. So you probably know that Italians can be very picky about their stuff.
Right.
I like sushi. Like, sushi is one of the things that I think I like the most. I live in New Haven, and New Haven is very diverse in terms of restaurants. It's not a big city, but there are plenty of restaurants to try, and I like to go around. So probably in the first 6 months when I moved to Yale, I tried all the restaurants, and I had friends that were living in New Haven for so long, and they didn't try all the restaurants that they try in my first 6 months in New Haven. So like, I shouldn't do it, but I like to eat out and like try things.
Definitely. I think it's a good way to explore new cuisine, find things that you might otherwise make at home yourself. And you mentioned reading as well. We love talking about books on this show and giving our listeners some recommendations if they're looking for their next great read. So, Renato, what is a book that you'd like to recommend for everybody today, whether it's related to science or not?
So one thing that I'm starting to read more is about books written by scientists, but they talk also about their science, but they talk also about their life and the issues that they had while like doing amazing things, because again, these are famous people that were asked to write a book. So like one that I read recently, but it's not a new book, it's kind of old, not super old, but oldish. So the title is The Common Thread, Science, Politics and Ethics and the Human Genome. This was written by one of the scientists that led the Human Genome Project, which is the project that sequenced the human genome for the first time in the early 2000s, like 2001, it was completed. It's a very nice book because you can read about the person behind the scientist and also about, because this was a massive project with so many investigators involved. And there is also like competition because there was 2 parallel efforts. And this is from the government funded. There was mainly from the US and the UK. They were funding this project. So from public funding. And then there was a private company that was also like trying to do the same. So there was this huge competition. And because it was about genetic data and the implication for that, there was ethical issue about having a company finishing first the sequencing of the human genome and maybe try to patent certain genes. So like it's a really cool book because you can understand more about all the things going on behind the science. Again, this was a massive project, but again, every project you are competing with other scientists, and then you need also to focus on how you are going to fund what you want to do. And that's not an easy task. So like sometimes people that don't work in science think that scientists, they have to focus only on their science, but there is a world around that. And I think this is a very nice book to learn about it.
Well, this is an excellent recommendation, Renato. We will add this. And I love these books that really highlight the stories, as you mentioned, behind the scientists and the scientific discoveries. And this one in particular kind of ties into your own research interests. So let's talk about that next. Renato, how do you describe what you do to someone who is outside of science or perhaps outside of your scientific field?
My primary research is about human genetics from different perspectives because I started in a group that was more focused on molecular anthropology, so understanding genetic diversity of worldwide population, and then I became more interested in trying to understand the predisposition to disease, and then was during my PhD, and then I moved at Yale and I started work on psychiatric disorder. What I'm currently working on, the main focus of my work is trying to understand the molecular mechanisms that are predisposing certain individuals to develop psychiatric disorders and symptoms. And again, like psychiatric disorder is a wide range of health outcomes. And so like within this group of illnesses, the one that I'm more focused on are the so-called internalizing disorder. So depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm trying to understand what are the mechanisms that are predisposing certain individuals to develop this disease. And in this area, I'm also trying to understand like why people that have this disease, they tend to have also other negative health outcomes. So for example, there is a known comorbidity between post-traumatic stress disorder and cardiovascular disease. So like there are a lot of hypotheses about what's going on there. If people that have post-traumatic stress disorder then develop cardiovascular disease as a consequence of PTSD, or is maybe due to other shared pathogenetic mechanism. What I'm doing is try to use genetic data, but the other molecular data like transcriptomic and epigenetics to try to understand what is predisposing people to get sick.
Very interesting. And I love how you bring all of these different disciplines together for this sort of multidisciplinary approach that you take with genetics, molecular biology, psychology, psychiatry. Was it sort of a difficult learning curve as you were bringing all of these fields together?
Sometimes it was by chance. My primary interest when I was in college was anthropology. And then because I was in a biology program, I connected the anthropology with like a molecular study and genetics. So I was interested in human evolution. But then during my PhD, there was the possibility to do kind of like a study focused on disease. And the first disease that I focused on was asthma, because we were a lab that were generating genetic data. We were started to collaborate with an hospital, and I was actually doing the recruitment. So I was talking with participants, explaining the study, collecting the information, collecting the biological samples. So like I was doing it from the beginning to the end. So I was talking with the participants, collecting the biological sample, bringing the samples to the lab, doing the DNA extraction, then the genotyping, so the molecular analysis to understand the genetic variation of each participant, and doing then the data analysis. From there, I was very interested to connect human evolution with the disease predisposition. And that was something that I was trying to connect, and I'm still trying to do that. And then by chance, I got an offer to move to Yale and work in psychiatry genetics during my PhD. So it was something new. And so like I moved, and it was kind of like a phase where I had to learn more about psychiatric disorders and the challenges to investigate these health outcomes that are specific to this domain. And from there, I learned more. And right now, I'm trying to bring all the knowledge that I got over the years about human evolution, diseases that are physical health outcomes, so asthma, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer, and connect that with my current interest, which is psychiatric disorders and in particular internalizing disorders.
Well, Renato, I think you have created a fascinating little niche in the research world for yourself. And I think having this opportunity, like you mentioned, to work with participants can be really motivating and can really drive home the potential impacts of the work that you do. And I know for a lot of people, the first time they get to work with participants, this is what sells them on a career in kind of more clinically oriented research. So I love talking about what motivates scientists or what inspires them. And one thing that really helps me get through a tough day is a motivational quote or a saying or just something I can keep in my mind. So do you have a favorite motivational quote or something that really motivates you in your life or science?
The quote that I like, which is genius is 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. And it's not because I believe that I'm a genius. It's only because the rest of the quote is more about how I got to where I am now. It's like maybe I got an idea, but then like getting the idea or having an idea about how to answer a scientific question is only the first step of a very long process. And it's a lot of hard work. It's not only getting, I got an idea and so I can solve this issue. It's, I got an idea. And then I have to convince other people that this idea is good. And so I need to get funding to support this idea. And then after you get funding, you need to coordinate a group and make the idea real. So translate the idea, interacting with participants, interacting with collaborators, and generate data, and then address possible issues because there are always issues and things that don't work as you expect. And then generate the data, try to understand what they are telling you because sometimes the data that you are generating, they are not in line with what you hypothesized at the beginning. And so you have to understand them. Because most of the times things are much more complicated than we expect. And we need to try to understand what the data are telling us. That's the quote and why I like this quote.
Definitely. I think there's a lot of hard work that goes behind every scientific discovery. Even these kind of small papers could be years in the making. And I think what helps us get through some of these challenging, long projects are the people that you get to work with in science. So whether they're mentors or peers who are helping cultivate some of your research ideas or just these inspirational figures that you've looked up to in your career. Renato, are there people who you think of as mentors or role models who have really helped you get to where you are today?
Of course, I had mentors. I had my mentor at Yale when I moved, Joel Gallanter, which is someone that I look up to. And there are like also, again, my department, the chair of my department is someone that is doing 1,000 things at the same time. And all the things are super high quality. And so these are people that I look up to and say, how can they do what they do? I wouldn't be able to do that. So I try to get inspiration for that. But what usually I try to look up is how different scientists work. And I try to get things that I like, things that I don't like, and then try to be the best combination of all the things that I like and I want to be. So I try to be kind of a puzzle of many different pieces. And I say, oh, I like the way this person interacted with their collaborators, or like I like how this person is able to engage participants. And I try, quote unquote, to steal from all the people that I have around, get inspired by everyone is around me. And they could be a senior person or a trainee, and working in science is very inspiring because you are able to meet amazing people from all over the world and travel all over the world and know other people that are working in different areas.
Definitely. And I love this idea of really assembling your own ideal career based on these different pieces that you learn or that you borrow, we'll say, from others around you. And you mentioned that already in college, you were sort of getting interested in anthropology, starting to get interested in potentially a scientific career path. But if we could rewind it back even further, Renato, could you tell us a little bit more about your scientific beginnings and maybe what turned your eye towards science in the first place?
In college, I was always very interested in the possibility to work in academia and have time to think about fundamental issues that was interested at that time. Again, in my family, there are not people that are academics. So like no one had that kind of career. So it wasn't from my family. Actually, they were not really understanding why I wanted to work in academia and to be a scientist because it wasn't something that anyone in my family did. I was very interested at the time to think about fundamental issues. Because again, like outside academia, depending on like you work in a company or if you have your own business, you have to deal with more practical issues, which again, it's great if you like the kind of stuff. Because again, if you look at academia and say, oh, you are thinking a lot about this fundamental issue, but what you are actually making to change things or to improve things. That's what I like in academia. This other end, you think about fundamental issues. And so like the things that you are delivering may have not an immediate impact on people, but long term, the hope is that they will change things in a major way, at least. This is the hope for every scientist. But only few people are able to make that kind of big impact on people's lives.
Certainly. And you mentioned that no one in your family had necessarily pursued this academic career path. How did you get interested in science if this wasn't where the inspiration came from? Kind of what was that first thing that made you think, this is what I want to do?
When I was doing my master, I was interacting with people that were doing a PhD or a postdoc or like junior faculty or more senior faculty. And they liked the kind of life, working on a project, going to conferences, talking with other scientists. And that was the life that I really liked, the kind of like possibility to focus on scientific issues. And again, at that time, I was more interested in human evolution. So to work on human evolution, it's something that you can do only in an academic environment. I don't think there are companies or businesses that are focusing on human evolution right now. That was the reason why I got into this kind of research. And then from there, like I learned more about biomedical research. And what I like of academia, what I liked from the beginning in academia is the freedom of develop your own ideas, get your own perspective on possible questions. And still what I like the most in academia is the freedom. Again, it's an apparent freedom because then you need to find funding and support to develop your own ideas, which sometimes it takes a lot of work.
Definitely. And we mentioned in our introduction that you had done your bachelor's degree, your master's degree, and your PhD all at the same academic institution. And then you made the jump all the way over here to Yale. So can you talk a little bit about how that came about, that opportunity for a postdoctoral fellowship at Yale?
This goes back to my quote unquote laziness, because actually I lived only in two cities in my life, Rome in Italy and New Haven in the US. One of the things I like a lot about academia is this possibility to travel the world and connect with people that are very far from you. The opportunity at Yale, there was a job opening for a postdoc at Yale, and then I applied, and then I got an interview, and after that I got the job. So like it was kind of unexpected because actually at the beginning I didn't want to move to the US. I wanted to stay in Europe, but then like again, the reputation of Yale and the person that had this opening and the opportunities to learn made me make the decision, oh yes, this is what I should do now. So like I made the jump. That's because a scientist in their career, most of the time, they have to move around. They have to change places and get a new environment to get different perspectives and get new ideas. So that's another of the things that I like a lot about science, especially in the US, that people really move around for their job.
And then I think you were fortunate you did not have to move around when you were looking for a faculty position. Can you talk about that transition from postdoc to faculty?
So, because I'm in a clinical department, at least in Yale clinical departments, there is more the possibility to transition from a trainee position to a faculty position. So like I was at that certain time at the end of my postdoc where I was starting to talk with my mentor about my next steps. And I was seeing other openings in other universities, but he liked the work that I was doing. So like also the chair and the leadership of my department was interested in the work that I was doing. So they made me an offer to stay, which was a positive thing because you don't need to do a moving, which is kind of time consuming. But at the same time, you have to demonstrate that, again, it's not only because you train at Yale that you are a Yale faculty. It's also because you are kind of worth it. And it was like also a challenge for me to demonstrate that I can build my own research program and I can create my research group independent from my previous, from the lab that I joined as a postdoc.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate you sharing your career path and giving us some insight into how you got to where you are today. And you are doing some remarkable research there at Yale. We talked about it a little bit, but is there a project that you have going on right now, Renato, that you are just the most excited about and want to share with me and listeners today?
One project that we are working on really hard right now is about internalizing disorders. So depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. And what we are trying to do now is to understand how these disorders are associated with COVID-19 outcomes. So like because of the pandemic and the big changes that we had to overcome the pandemic, during the pandemic and after the pandemic, there is this evidence about a comorbidity between certain psychiatric disorders and COVID-19, both because people that got severe COVID-19 may have developed this disease after, or people that had psychiatric disorder before the disease were more predisposed to have more severe symptoms. And so what we are trying to do now is to understand which are the molecular basis of this comorbidity and trying to understand possibly which could be the long-term consequence of these associations. So this was a project that was very interesting because we started with the recruiting new participants because again, COVID-19 is an outcome, a disease that we had only recently. So like we enrolled new participants for this study. We connected with communities in the New Haven area to have a diverse cohort that can represent people with different backgrounds. And that was very rewarding because again, you connect with participants, but it's a two-way road. You want them to participate in the study, but at the same time, you have to explain what is the study is about and what you are doing and what can help people with what we are doing. That was very rewarding because I was able to connect with people more directly. And then after that, again, we got the biological samples and we are doing molecular analysis right now. And we hope to get the results that can help people to understand better how the impact of COVID-19 can affect mental health long term.
I think this is very interesting, and I think in a very important area of research as well. And I think there's a lot of other factors that come into play here, whether it's age, physical activity, et cetera, the list could go on and on. What are some of the factors that you're thinking about that might also be part of this equation of how these things are related?
There are many factors, like also socioeconomic factors, people that got exposed to more risky environments so that they were more likely to get exposed, or people that had other comorbidities that predispose them to have more severe outcomes, medications that people were taking, vaccination status is something that we are also looking at. These are all aspects. So we have a long assessment with hundreds of questions that we are asking to participants. And the idea is to kind of use this big data and trying to understand which are the factors more relevant. Possible difference between sexes. We see that men and women are differently affected by this comorbidity because, for example, for internalizing disorders, we know that women tend to have a higher prevalence of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And so we want to understand how this is going to be affecting COVID-19 outcomes between people that didn't have any severe symptoms and people that had severe symptoms due to the infection.
This is a fascinating project, Renato. We look forward to seeing the results coming out in the future. And I know it can be really exciting to, like you said, be able to make those connections within your community, to be able to go out in the field, so to speak. But I think there are challenges with that kind of research and just challenges with science in general, as we hinted at previously. So I'd love to talk about some of these challenges that you have faced. Is there an example of a major failure that you've had or just a problem that you really struggled with that you could tell us about and maybe talk us through how you worked through that tough time?
The biggest challenge that I had as a scientist, it was really at the very beginning. I define myself as a computational biologist. So most of the time I work on my computer and connecting with servers in the US or around the world and analyzing molecular data and clinical data of sometimes millions of people. But there is a reason why I am a computational biologist. So when I started, I mentioned that I was doing basically all the steps from recruiting participants to analyze data, like generating molecular data on the bench. So with my pipette, and I was generating kind of data, which between doing the analysis of the data and generating the molecular data, the thing that I liked the most was analyzing the data. And one of the reasons is because I wasn't really good on the bench, like doing pipetting things, like generating the molecular data that I needed later for the analysis. So at the really beginning, one of the challenges that I had was with contamination. Contamination in genetics is when you are doing some kind of genetic analysis of an individual, and instead of only genotyping that individual, you are also somehow getting DNA that is not from that individual, but is from people that are around you in the lab. And at the really beginning in the lab that I was, for one of these projects that we were starting, we were having some issues about contaminations. So we were not able to discriminate which individuals we are analyzing. And so we had to find a way to clean things up in the lab and separate things more. And it took probably a month. The issue was that we were scaling up the number of samples that we were analyzing. This created some kind of not completely clean environment to ensure the quality of the data that we're generating. And so it took a couple of months to organize everything. And that was the time that I was starting. And I was really struggling to find a solution. And we were discussing with other people in the lab how to make things work. At that time, I was really in a tough place because, again, I was just starting. So it was the first time that I was struggling and I was questioning myself, I would like to be a scientist, but maybe I'm not good enough. That was probably the toughest challenge that I had to overcome. And it was really at the beginning.
In some cases, it can be good to sort of get those out of the way early so you know what you're getting into. But at the same time, I think that troubleshooting can be so frustrating sometimes, particularly when you don't even know enough to know what you should be changing.
Yeah. But overcoming challenges is something that scientists have to get used to. It's something that always I tell to my trainees. So, for example, in computational biology, especially for people that are just starting to learn, it's basically like learning a new language. So I say, you are learning. It doesn't seem like that you are learning because, again, you are struggling to debug your code and to learn how to code the commands, but you are actually learning. It's only that it takes time, especially at the very beginning, to get out some results. So like what I say to people, to try to be resilient and be able to continue to do what they are doing. And also I say, look, if I see that things are not progressing, I'm going to tell you. So you need to trust me that things are moving along. You are learning. It's only that it takes some time to get results out.
Definitely. And I think that can be helpful just to have a good supportive mentor to help you out if you get stuck and encourage you to keep moving forward, because I think those successes in science can be so rewarding when you get to them. So Renato, do you have a favorite success story, whether it was a really big win or even just a small but particularly meaningful victory for you that you'd like to tell us about today?
There is a recent study that we published, and it was a study, again, like several of the studies that we are doing in collaboration with the other groups in the US and around the world, because again, collaborative science is very important, especially for genetic research where we need big data sets like that include millions of individuals. But in a recent study, we were able to get access to data from different sources and do like a large genetic study of anxiety disorders in 1.2 million individuals. And this was a study that we did only in our group. So like the people that contributed mainly to the study are people that are in my lab. It was particularly rewarding because we had a lot of people that learned, they started in the lab and learned something in the lab and were able to contribute. So it was really a group effort. And again, we were able to complete the study, to publish the study, and we got really good feedback from a lot of scientists around the world that appreciated the work that we did.
Definitely. And I know in this study, you and the group identified more than 100 genes associated with anxiety. So can you talk about what are the potential impacts of this work?
So yes, that was very exciting because again, like for many other psychiatric disorders were already present a large number of genes that were associated with different mental illnesses. And this was the first time for anxiety that we were able to identify such large number of genes. So with this information, what our group and other groups around the world, because again, like once we published the study, we also released the data that we used, is that we are trying to translate this information, trying to identify possible molecular targets for defining drugs that can help people. Again, this does not mean that we are going to have a new drug or find a better drug for anxiety in 6 months, 1 year, but it's a very long process where we are trying to identify which are the biological processes that are underlining these genes. So like, again, with 100 genes, we can identify that if multiple genes are in the same biological process and how this biological process is related to anxiety, and maybe able to identify a drug that can target this to prevent this pathogenic process leading to anxiety. So this is something that we are currently working on, trying to translate these genetic associations in information about the disease and information that can help people affected by the disease. Again, it's not something that we are going to be able to do in the short term, but it's a work that will contribute to this process.
Definitely. I think don't sell yourself short. This is an important step on that path to hopefully getting to a better care or better treatment for people with these anxiety disorders. So how did you celebrate this exciting win when that paper was accepted or when the project was completed?
If I have to think about it, I don't think we actually celebrated. So we celebrated with telling congratulations to everyone. That was great. But we didn't have a party about it, which maybe was good to have. Because the other thing which I do to myself is that after I get something like this study published, because until the study is published, the work is not done. But then after the work is done, there are other things that you have to think about. There was like a very little celebration, maybe too little. And then we moved immediately to other things, because that's the thing about being a scientist. There are always new things that you are chasing. So sometimes I don't take time to say, oh, we as a group were able to accomplish this, but instead like, oh, we did this, let's move on.
I think that is a remarkable accomplishment. And I think wonderful that you were able to kind of have that experience of a big success with the members of your laboratory. And we mentioned earlier in our conversation that you are passionate about travel. And I think this is a really fun aspect of careers in science as well, because you get to travel for conferences, to work with colleagues all over the world. So do you have a favorite place that your science has taken you, Renato?
I just came back from a travel in Singapore for a conference. And again, Singapore is an amazing place, and I was able to travel to Thailand. And again, these are amazing countries. My favorite country that I ever went to for work is Japan. It's an amazing place. I was there for 3 weeks for 2 conferences. So there were 2 different conferences around the same time. And so I was able to stay there for 3 weeks. And I fell in love with the place. It's an amazing place. I like to visit because you have a lot of history to look around and the food is amazing and people are amazing. And I'm really looking forward to go back, but I was not able to because again, I went to Japan probably more than 5 years ago. And I'm still trying to find a way to go back. But again, because of work and life, it's not that close that you can say, oh, let's take a long weekend there.
Right. Well, I think these travel opportunities can be absolutely amazing to be able to go to places, like you said, that are far away that you might not otherwise be able to go to. And you said 3 weeks in Japan. What areas were you able to visit? And were you able to do some sort of fun sightseeing along the way?
I was in Tokyo and then in Kumamoto, which is a small city in the south. The nice thing is that the 2 conferences that I had were 1 week apart of each other. So I did 1 week, the first conference in Tokyo. Then I took 1 week to visit a little bit of Japan. And then the 3rd week, I went to Kumamoto in the south for the 2nd conference. It was a perfect trip. Like I had a lot of fun. And again, I had the opportunity to meet other scientists from different countries. Because depending on where the conference is, you sometimes have different people attending. So if you go to a conference in Asia, you are able to connect more with people in Asia, in Australia. If you have a conference in the US, you are able to get more investigators from North America, and South America, and Europe. It's also nice to change because you are able to connect with different scientists.
Oh, absolutely. I think these travel opportunities are wonderful. And if our listeners are able to go to Japan soon, we'll be jealous. But what must they do or see while they're there? Is there something that you think they have to put on their itinerary?
You can just walk around and enjoy yourself. The nicest thing is that you have like ancient temples and modern buildings. I'm talking about Tokyo. It's amazing how these 2 things can live together and they can live together in harmony. It's not that, for example, I'm from Roma, which we have a lot of ancient buildings there, but sometimes you see like modern buildings and ancient buildings don't live well together. Instead, like my feeling in Japan is that was in harmony. And for example, you were able to go in a park in the middle of Tokyo, which it's a very dense city with a lot of buildings, a lot of people. And then you go in a park and it seems to be in a completely different world because you have this ancient temple and quiet around you. And instead you are in the middle of the city. It was amazing.
Oh, it sounds easy to get away from sort of the buzz of the city with these kind of quiet places interspersed.
Yeah.
That sounds lovely. And I think one of the other things that's wonderful that you highlighted here is just the ability to meet with scientists from all over the world. And I think oftentimes scientists are portrayed a particular way in the media, and we try to break some of those stereotypes by just showcasing these human moments in science, the fun, funny, strange, and creative things that scientists do when they're together, whether it's quirky lab traditions or just funny or fun memories that you've shared with colleagues. So do you have an example of one of these human moments that you could share with us today, Renato?
There is something that I think is very human. It was when I was doing my PhD in Italy, in the department where I was. So it was the lab where I was at the time and other labs around. We had, which is maybe a very Italian thing to do. On Friday, instead of having lunch in the university near the lab where there was the dining area, we went to have lunch outside. We went to a place that was very close to the university. And on Friday in Rome, you're supposed to have fish. And we were having almost every Friday spaghetti with clams and some fried calamari. And it was kind of became a tradition for the time that I was there. So it was really fun. And you were able to connect with people in other labs and talk about science, but also talk about life. So like it was a nice way to connect. Especially students should be able to do this kind of activities because it kind of helps them to relax. Because sometimes, especially when you are very young, and you are not used to the challenges of the work, it can become very stressful. And so sometimes you have to step out, breathe, talk about something else, and then you can go back. Especially at that time. So sometimes I'm working on something, I'm not able to find a solution. If I step outside, think about something else and go back to that, my brain kind of relaxes and is able to find, oh, that's the way I should do it. So I think this is particularly important for students to be able to understand that sometimes you need to step back and relax.
Definitely. And I think investing that time to build your network, to build those relationships with colleagues is really valuable as well. And I love the idea of celebrating the end of the week by just getting outside, seeing the sun, enjoying great food together. So I think that's a wonderful tradition. And I know you are working on some big problems, big questions in the lab that you're in at the moment. So let's talk about what you would do if we took away all of the barriers. I know often in science, funding, staff, technology, time, feasibility, you name it, the list could go on, are often holding us back from answering the questions we would most like to answer. So Renato, if you could do anything, what is the one research question you want to answer most?
The question that I would like to answer is how human evolution shaped the predisposition of certain disease. This is something that I'm already doing, but I would like to do it even in a larger scale. For example, a major limitation that we have in genetic research is that most of the data that we have right now were generated from participants of European descent. We don't have enough diversity, especially to represent the diversity that we have around the world. And this is a big limitation, both for biomedical research in general, but also to understand human evolution, because the more diverse is the data that we have, the more information we can get about how this diversity was generated and which were the dynamics that led to what we are seeing right now. If I could have a wish to do something like a bigger, what I'm doing is that more diverse datasets and being able to have something that actually reflects the variation that we see around the world. With that kind of data, we would be able to understand better which are these dynamics that kind of like shaped our history, but also are determining our future in terms of disease risk. That would be the big question that I would like to answer and make the connection between these two things, because sometimes they are seen as separate issues, especially because in our genome is the product of our evolution and is determining the predisposition of future disease. So these two things are well connected. And so like what I would like to have is more diverse data, again, that can represent actually what we have around the world, and then use this data to connect these two aspects.
Well, I think this is fascinating. I really love this idea of really just upscaling the research that you're doing, enriching these data sets with more representative data. And I think this is something where we're slowly chipping away at the problem, but there's a lot of work that remains to be done. So we appreciate you bringing up this big picture question for us to ponder today. And I'd love to end with sharing advice. So Renato, you've shared your career path, and I think you've had some wonderful experiences along the way. Is there a piece of advice that somebody gave you at some point that really helped you that you want to share with listeners today?
I think the advice that shaped the most my career is to be persistent. Science takes time, and scientists have to deal a lot with rejections. We deal more with rejection than acceptances. It takes persistence and resilience, be able to grow a thick skin and be able to have a good balance. You should listen to people, but not too much.
Right.
You may have your own idea. And sometimes when ideas are very new and question established truth that sometimes not correct, you will find people pushing back to you. But maybe you are right. You need to be able to listen to people, but also sometimes be able to stick with your ideas and try to prove them. So it takes time and it takes rejections. People that want to be scientists will have paper rejected, grant application rejected. It sometimes is up because you put a lot of effort on that and people question themselves all the time. I still do that. So be persistent, trust yourself, but not too much. It's a fine line like between, okay, I have an idea, I want to demonstrate that it's correct, and sometimes being too arrogant and not listening to what is around you. So it's a very fine line that sometimes we have to walk.
Definitely. I think that is such an important point in terms of the balance that you mentioned, sort of trust yourself and trust others, but neither too much.
Yes, that's the perfect summary.
Well, I love that advice. Is there any other last message that you'd like to share with listeners at the end of our conversation today?
It's very related to what I just said, but hard work pays out. Sometimes you need to work to move along, and sometimes you have to be resilient and continue to work also if you are not seeing results. So sometimes you have to think long term. That's what still I'm doing. So when I started, I'm giving me 5 years to try to become a scientist and see if I can do this as a career. And I still do that. Sometimes I say, oh, right now maybe it's an hard time. And I say, okay, I'm giving me that amount of time to try to prove myself that this is the way I should do it.
I love that. I think keeping that big picture in mind and setting those longer term goals can be helpful in sort of slowly working towards them. So we appreciate you sharing these insights and advice with listeners. If our listeners would like to learn more about you, Renato, and the work that you're doing, what is the best way for them to do so?
There is my webpage on the Yale website where people can look information about my email and my social media accounts. So people can reach me out via email. They can look updates about the research that my work group is doing. They can also connect via social media, Twitter, LinkedIn. Usually I reply to people that connect with ask questions from these different sources. And I'm happy to talk about science. Again, for people that are interested in a particular topic, or also like students that would like to learn more about how they can make a career as a scientist. I'm happy to interact with people about these topics.
Fantastic. Well, listeners, definitely get connected with Renato, learn more about the exciting work that he's doing. And Renato, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. It was such a pleasure to chat with you.
Thank you so much, you, for the invite. These were really nice questions. They went through all my career and maybe remember about issues that I had in the past and fun things also. It was great.
Well, we appreciate you sharing your path with us. And listeners, it's been wonderful to have you here as well. Join us again next time for another episode of People Behind the Science.